Lady Anastasia Deathmoor's fingers traced the cold marble of her first husband's tomb with practiced sorrow. Her black silk dress rustling softly in the autumn breeze that swept through Thornshire Cemetery. The carved inscription read, "Lord Edmund Blackthorne, beloved husband, taken too soon." But the tears that glistened in her emerald eyes were as artificial as the grief that had made her the most pitied woman in the kingdom. What none of the mourners gathered around her knew was that those same delicate fingers had been the instruments of Edmund's destruction, and that the woman they comforted was already calculating her next victim. The year was 1847, and the Industrial Revolution had brought both prosperity and pestilence to the northern kingdoms. Disease traveled faster than ever before on steam-powered ships and railway carriages, making sudden deaths from mysterious illnesses tragically common. It was in this chaos of medical uncertainty that Anastasia had found her perfect hunting ground, where a woman's touch could bring death as surely as any blade, yet leave no trace that any investigator could follow. Anastasia's origins were as carefully crafted as everything else about her existence. The story she told and that society had accepted without question painted her as the sole survivor of a devastating plague outbreak that had consumed her childhood home of Ravensgate Manor. When she was merely 16, her parents, siblings, and servants had all succumbed to a virulent strain of the sweating sickness, leaving young Anastasia to wander the countryside as a traumatized orphan until she was taken in by distant relatives who recognized her noble bloodline despite her tragic circumstances. The truth was far more sinister. Anastasia had indeed been present during the plague outbreak at Ravensgate Manor, but she had not been a victim. She had been the cause. Even as a child, she had possessed an unusual constitution that allowed her to carry deadly diseases without succumbing to them herself. Where this ability came from, whether it was a curse of birth or something more supernatural, remained a mystery even to her. What she did understand, with the cold clarity that would define her entire existence, was that this power made her uniquely suited to acquire everything she desired through the simple act of spreading death. The plague at Ravensgate had been her first experiment in controlled murder. She had begun by contaminating the water supply that served the servants' quarters, watching with scientific fascination as the illness spread through the lower levels of the household. Her own family had fallen next, succumbing to mysterious fevers that the local physicians attributed to miasmatic vapors rising from the diseased servant. By the time the outbreak had run its course, Anastasia was the only survivor, emerging from the devastation with claims of having been miraculously spared by divine providence. The inheritance from her family's estate had provided her with enough wealth to establish herself in polite society. But Anastasia's ambitions extended far beyond mere survival. She had discovered that her unique constitution allowed her to carry and transmit a wide variety of lethal diseases, each with different symptoms and progression patterns. More importantly, she learned that she could control the timing and intensity of transmission through careful management of her contact with potential victims. Her first husband, Lord Edmund Blackthorne, had been selected through a process as methodical as any military campaign. Edmund was a wealthy widower in his 50s, possessed of substantial estates but lacking direct heirs. His first wife had died in childbirth along with their infant son, leaving him vulnerable to the charms of a beautiful young woman who seemed to understand his grief. Anastasia had cultivated their courtship with exquisite care, presenting herself as a fellow survivor of tragedy, who could offer both companionship and the possibility of legitimate offspring to carry on his family name. The wedding had been a grand affair, celebrated throughout the county as a union that promised happiness for two souls who had suffered great losses. Edmund was a kind and generous husband, genuinely fond of his young bride and eager to provide her with every comfort and luxury that his wealth could afford. For nearly a year, Anastasia played the role of devoted wife with consummate skill, learning the details of his business affairs, social connections, and financial arrangements, while waiting for the optimal moment to begin his destruction. The method she chose for Edmund's elimination was a slow-acting fever that mimicked the symptoms of consumption, a common enough ailment that would attract no unusual scrutiny from physicians or coroners. She began by contaminating his personal effects, his shaving brush, his pillow, the wine glasses from which he drank his evening port, with microscopic amounts of infected material that she carried within her own system. The progression was gradual and seemingly natural, beginning with minor fatigue and occasional coughing that could be attributed to the changing season. As Edmund's condition worsened, Anastasia transformed herself into the perfect picture of a devoted wife caring for her ailing husband. She insisted on preparing his meals personally, claiming that her feminine touch would provide comfort that servants could not match. She spent hours at his bedside reading to him, applying cool compresses to his fevered brow, and administering the medicines prescribed by the increasingly baffled physicians who attended him. Her dedication was so complete and so touching that even Edmund's business associates and distant relatives, who might otherwise have viewed her inheritance with suspicion, were moved to tears by her obvious devotion. The final stages of Edmund's illness were particularly agonizing, both for the dying man and for the household that watched his slow decline. Anastasia maintained her vigil with unwavering dedication, her performance so convincing that she sometimes almost believed in her own grief. When Edmund finally succumbed after 3 months of suffering, his death was attributed to a particularly virulent case of consumption complicated by his advanced age and weakened constitution. The local physician signed the death certificate without hesitation, and the coroner saw no reason to question the obvious cause of death. Edmund's funeral was attended by hundreds of mourners who came to pay their respects to a respected member of the community and to offer condolences to his tragically widowed bride. Anastasia's behavior throughout the ceremony was exemplary, displaying exactly the right mixture of profound grief and dignified composure that society expected from a woman of her station. Her black mourning dress had been specially tailored to enhance her pale beauty, and the tears that she shed were so perfectly timed and proportioned that even the most cynical observers were convinced of their sincerity. The inheritance from Edmund's estate was substantial, providing Anastasia with not only immediate wealth but also valuable social connections and a reputation as a woman of quality, who had been blessed with good fortune despite her tragic losses. More importantly, her successful debut as a widow had taught her valuable lessons about the mechanics of public grief and the expectations that society placed upon women in her position. She had learned to modulate her emotions for maximum effect, to time her displays of vulnerability to coincide with moments when they would generate the greatest sympathy and support. With Edmund's death, Anastasia had also gained access to circles of society that would have been closed to her as a mere orphaned noble. Wealthy widows occupied a unique position in the social hierarchy, possessing both independence and respectability that made them attractive companions for eligible bachelors, while maintaining the protective status that prevented too much scrutiny of their affairs. She was invited to the finest houses, included in the most exclusive social gatherings, and courted by men who saw her combination of beauty, wealth, and tragic romantic history as irresistibly appealing. Her second husband was selected within 6 months of Edmund's funeral, after what society deemed an appropriately respectful period of mourning. Baron Frederick Ashworth was a man in his early 40s, possessed of extensive mining interests and a castle in the Scottish Highlands that would provide Anastasia with both additional wealth and geographic mobility that might prove useful in future operations. Frederick was also a man of robust health and vigorous constitution, presenting a more challenging target that would allow her to refine her techniques and test the limits of her capabilities. The courtship with Frederick was necessarily different from her approach with Edmund, as her new suitor was a more skeptical and experienced man who had avoided marriage for over a decade despite considerable social pressure from his family. Anastasia adapted her strategy accordingly, presenting herself as a woman who had loved deeply and lost tragically. but who was now ready to embrace life and love again with the wisdom that came from having faced grief and emerged stronger. She emphasized her practical capabilities alongside her beauty, demonstrating knowledge of household management and business affairs that impressed Frederick and convinced him that she would be a valuable partner rather than merely an ornamental wife. Their wedding was a smaller affair than her first, conducted in Frederick's private chapel with only immediate family and close friends in attendance. This suited Anastasia perfectly, as it reduced the number of witnesses to their domestic arrangements and provided her with greater freedom to implement her plans without constant observation from curious society matrons. Frederick's castle was isolated enough to prevent casual visits from neighbors, while being sufficiently staffed to maintain the appearances of a proper noble household. Frederick's death, when it came after 18 months of marriage, was attributed to a weak heart, complicated by the stress of managing his extensive business interests during a period of economic uncertainty. The symptoms had begun subtly, with episodes of chest pain and shortness of breath that Frederick initially dismissed as the natural consequences of advancing age and sedentary habits. Anastasia had encouraged him to consult physicians, but had also suggested that the problem might be ameliorated through changes in diet and lifestyle that she was eager to help implement. The contamination method she used with Frederick was more sophisticated than her approach with Edmund, involving the introduction of bacterial agents that would attack his cardiovascular system while producing symptoms that could easily be misinterpreted as heart disease. She had learned to culture and concentrate various pathogenic organisms within her own system, allowing her to deliver precise doses through seemingly innocent means such as sharing meals, exchanging personal items, or providing intimate physical contact that appeared to be nothing more than normal marital affection. Frederick's final weeks were marked by increasing frequency and severity of cardiac episodes, during which Anastasia's tender care and obvious distress convinced everyone that she was a devoted wife watching helplessly as her beloved husband slipped away despite all medical efforts to save him. When he died in his sleep on a cold February morning with Anastasia sleeping peacefully beside him, the physician who examined the body found clear evidence of heart failure and no reason to suspect anything other than natural causes. The wealth and properties that Anastasia inherited from Frederick's estate were considerably greater than what she had received from Edmund, providing her with financial resources that guaranteed her independence and social status for the foreseeable future. More importantly, the experience of successfully eliminating a second husband had refined her understanding of disease transmission and symptom management, while also teaching her valuable lessons about the investigation and documentation procedures that followed suspicious deaths. Her third husband, Count Reginald Thornton, was selected after a year of careful observation during which Anastasia established herself as one of the most eligible widows in the kingdom. Reginald was a man of nearly 60, possessed of vast agricultural estates and political connections that extended to the royal court itself. His advanced age and documented history of minor health complaints made him an ideal target for methods that would produce death through apparent natural causes, while his political prominence would provide Anastasia with access to higher levels of society, where even greater opportunities might present themselves. Reginald's courtship of the beautiful young widow was conducted with all the formality and ceremony befitting a man of his station and age. He showered her with expensive gifts, arranged elaborate entertainments for her amusement, and made no secret of his intention to make her his wife, despite the significant difference in their ages. For her part, Anastasia played the role of a woman who was gradually allowing herself to hope for happiness again after suffering such devastating losses in her previous marriages. Their wedding was a grand social event that was attended by members of the royal family and reported in the fashionable magazines that documented the activities of high society. Anastasia's wedding dress was a masterpiece of French couture that emphasized her ethereal beauty while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her station as a twice-widowed lady of quality. The ceremony itself was conducted with full religious pomp in the cathedral that had served Reginald's family for centuries, creating a public spectacle that firmly established Anastasia's place among the highest ranks of the nobility. Reginald's death came after 2 years of marriage, during which Anastasia had carefully studied his habits, relationships, and financial arrangements while gradually implementing the contamination protocols that would eventually kill him. The method she chose was a digestive ailment that mimicked the symptoms of stomach cancer, a disease that was both common enough to avoid suspicion and severe enough to explain the gradual wasting away that would characterize his final months. The progression of Reginald's illness followed the pattern that Anastasia had perfected through her previous experiences, beginning with minor digestive complaints that could be attributed to rich food and sedentary habits, then escalating through increasingly severe episodes of pain, nausea, and weakness that left him bedridden and dependent on her constant care. Throughout his decline, she maintained the persona of a devoted wife who was sacrificing her own health and happiness to provide comfort and support during his suffering. When Reginald finally died after months of agony, the attending physicians agreed that he had succumbed to a particularly aggressive form of stomach cancer that had resisted all attempts at treatment. The autopsy that was performed at Anastasia's own request revealed extensive damage to his digestive system that was entirely consistent with the suspected diagnosis, while providing additional evidence of her cooperation with medical authorities and her obvious desire to understand what had claimed her beloved husband's life. The inheritance from Reginald's estate elevated Anastasia to the ranks of the wealthiest women in the kingdom, providing her with resources that exceeded the combined wealth of many noble families. More significantly, her position as the widow of a man with direct connections to the royal court had established her as a figure of considerable social and political importance, whose opinions and preferences carried weight in circles where major decisions were made about the kingdom's future. By the time of Reginald's death, rumors had begun to circulate in certain quarters about the remarkable misfortune that seemed to follow Lady Anastasia Deathmoor through her marriages. 3 husbands dead of natural causes within a span of 6 years was unusual enough to attract notice from those who specialized in observing patterns in human behavior. However, these whispers were countered by the obvious facts of Anastasia's exemplary conduct, her generous charitable activities, and the genuine grief that she displayed after each loss. The investigation that was quietly initiated by certain government officials was conducted with the utmost discretion, as the authorities recognized that any public inquiry into Anastasia's affairs would need to be based on concrete evidence rather than mere suspicion. The investigators who examined the circumstances surrounding her 3 marriages found no evidence of foul play, no witnesses who could testify to anything other than her devoted care for her husbands, and no medical findings that suggested anything other than tragic but natural deaths. What the investigators could not have known was that they were dealing with a form of murder so subtle and sophisticated that it left no traces that contemporary medical science could detect or identify. Anastasia's method of killing through disease transmission was essentially perfect, producing deaths that were not only untraceable but actually indistinguishable from genuine natural causes. Even if investigators had suspected the truth, they would have been unable to prove it using the forensic techniques and medical knowledge available in the mid-19th century. As Anastasia stood in the cemetery that autumn afternoon, surrounded by the sympathy and support of a society that viewed her as a tragic figure deserving of compassion and assistance, she was already planning her next move in a game where she held all the advantages and her opponents didn't even know they were playing. The 3 marble tombstones that marked her previous victories were merely the beginning of what she intended to be a much longer and more ambitious campaign of murder and acquisition. The sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path interrupted her contemplation, as the small group of mourners who had accompanied her to the cemetery began to gather around her with expressions of concern and offers of comfort. Among them was Baron Frederick's nephew, a young man named Thomas who had inherited a portion of his uncle's estate and who had been notably attentive to the beautiful widow during the months since Frederick's funeral. His presence represented both an opportunity and a potential complication, as his youth and vigor would require different techniques than those she had used on her older husbands. As Anastasia turned from the tombstone to accept the condolences and support being offered by her companions, Her mind was already working through the calculations and preparations that would be necessary for her next campaign of seduction and murder. The game was becoming more challenging and more rewarding with each victory, and she was confident that her next husband would provide both greater wealth and more refined entertainment than any of his predecessors. The perfect widow smiled through her tears as she allowed herself to be escorted from the cemetery, her black silk dress trailing behind her like a shadow of the deaths she had caused and the deaths she was already planning. In her wake, the marble tombstones stood as silent monuments to her success, while ahead of her lay a future filled with unlimited possibilities for a woman who had learned to kill with a touch and to profit from every life she destroyed. The gaslight flickered against the mahogany paneling of Baron Frederick Ashworth's study as Lady Anastasia Deathmoor carefully arranged the evening's tea service, her movements as precise and deliberate as a surgeon preparing for an operation. The silver tray gleamed with reflected light, its surface bearing an elegant porcelain set that had been wedding gift from the Baron's sister, a woman who would soon discover that her generous gesture had become an instrument of murder. But tonight's tea was no ordinary social ritual. It was the beginning of an elaborate performance that would culminate in Frederick's death and establish Anastasia as the most sophisticated killer of her generation. 6 months had passed since her marriage to Baron Frederick, and Anastasia had used every day to study her husband's routines, habits, and vulnerabilities with the dedication of a natural historian documenting a rare species. Frederick was a more challenging target than her previous husbands, possessed of robust health, keen intelligence, and a suspicious nature that had kept him unmarried well into his 40s. His mining enterprises had brought him into contact with rough men in dangerous situations that had honed his instincts for detecting threats and deception. Yet even his considerable experience with human duplicity had not prepared him for the kind of enemy that now shared his bed and his table. The method Anastasia had chosen for Frederick's elimination was her most ambitious yet, involving a slow-acting neurological poison that would mimic the symptoms of a progressive brain disease. The substance was derived from a rare fungus that grew in the deepest shafts of abandoned mines, a parasite that she had cultivated within her own system through months of careful exposure and conditioning. The symptoms it produced were both dramatic and seemingly natural, beginning with minor memory lapses and coordination problems that could be attributed to stress or overwork, then progressing through episodes of confusion, personality changes, and finally complete mental collapse. Frederick entered his study that evening in excellent spirits, having concluded a profitable negotiation with a consortium of railway investors who were eager to transport ore from his Scottish properties to the industrial centers of the South. His success in business had always been a source of pride and satisfaction, but lately he had found even greater pleasure in the domestic happiness that his marriage to Anastasia had brought into his previously solitary existence. The beautiful young woman had proven to be not only a devoted wife but also an intelligent companion who took genuine interest in his affairs and offered valuable insights into the social and political connections that could enhance his enterprises. As Frederick settled into his favorite leather chair beside the fireplace, Anastasia served his tea with the graceful movements that had first caught his attention during their courtship. The porcelain cup was warm against his fingers as he accepted it, and the familiar ritual of their evening conversation created an atmosphere of comfortable intimacy that had become one of the most cherished aspects of his daily routine. What he could not have known was that the delicate floral pattern on the cup's rim had been treated with microscopic amounts of the fungal extract that would begin his destruction with the very first sip. The initial symptoms appeared within days of that first contaminated serving, manifesting as brief episodes of confusion that Frederick attributed to the mental fatigue that came from managing complex business negotiations. He would occasionally lose track of conversations mid-sentence, or find himself unable to recall the names of business associates he had known for years. These lapses were minor enough to dismiss as the natural consequences of advancing age and increased responsibility, but they represented the beginning of a carefully orchestrated decline that would unfold over the coming months. Anastasia's performance during this period was masterful, displaying just the right mixture of concern and reassurance as she helped Frederick cope with what appeared to be minor memory problems. She began keeping detailed notes of his symptoms and medications, presenting herself as a devoted wife who was determined to help her husband maintain his health and mental acuity despite the stresses of his demanding career. Her suggestions for treatments and lifestyle changes were always sensible and well-researched, earning the gratitude of both Frederick and the physicians who attended him. As Frederick's condition progressed, Anastasia increased both the frequency and concentration of the fungal applications, using a variety of delivery methods that ensured constant exposure while maintaining the appearance of natural disease progression. His shaving soap was contaminated with extracts that would be absorbed through his skin during his morning routine. His favorite pipe tobacco was treated with powdered spores that he would inhale during his evening relaxation. Even his clothing was infected through contact with garments that Anastasia wore after treating them with the invisible poison. The neurological symptoms began to manifest more dramatically after several weeks of this systematic contamination. Frederick started experiencing episodes of disorientation that left him confused about his location or the time of day. His handwriting became increasingly erratic, and he began to have difficulty managing the complex calculations that his business required. Most disturbing of all were the personality changes that gradually transformed his naturally suspicious and cautious nature into something approaching childlike trust and dependence. The transformation was subtle enough that even Frederick's closest business associates initially attributed his changed behavior to the mellowing effects of marriage and domestic happiness. He became more generous in his dealings, more trusting of partners who had previously encountered his sharp skepticism, and more willing to delegate responsibilities that he had always insisted on managing personally. Those who had known him longest remarked on how marriage had softened his hard edges and brought out a gentler side of his character that few had suspected existed. Anastasia encouraged these interpretations while privately monitoring Frederick's decline with the scientific detachment of a researcher studying an interesting specimen. She documented the progression of his symptoms in a coded journal that she kept hidden among her personal effects, noting the relationship between dosage levels and symptom severity with the precision of a trained physician. The data she collected would be invaluable for future operations, allowing her to refine her techniques and predict the timeline for subsequent eliminations with greater accuracy. As Frederick's mental faculties continued to deteriorate, Anastasia gradually assumed greater control over his business affairs, presenting herself as a devoted wife who was reluctantly accepting additional responsibilities to protect her husband's interests during his period of illness. The transition was so smooth and well managed that Frederick's business partners and legal advisors barely noticed the shift in authority, accepting Anastasia's explanations and appreciating her obvious dedication to preserving her husband's legacy. The final stages of Frederick's illness were both tragic and theatrical, as his once sharp mind crumbled into confusion and dependency that left him unable to recognize longtime friends or manage basic daily functions. Anastasia's care during this period was exemplary, hiring the finest nurses and physicians available while maintaining a constant vigil at his bedside. Her obvious distress and exhaustion convinced everyone that she was sacrificing her own health and happiness to provide comfort for her dying husband. Frederick's death came on a cold November morning, after a final night of delirium during which he called out for his deceased mother and spoke of childhood memories that seemed more real to him than his present circumstances. Anastasia was holding his hand when he drew his last breath, her tears of grief so convincing that even the attending physician was moved to comfort her in her loss. The cause of death was officially recorded as a rare form of progressive brain disease that had resisted all attempts at treatment, and the autopsy revealed extensive neurological damage that was entirely consistent with the suspected diagnosis. The inheritance from Frederick's estate was even more substantial than Anastasia had anticipated, including not only his liquid assets and property holdings, but also controlling interests in several mining companies that generated continuous revenue streams. More importantly, the legal documents that Frederick had signed during his mental decline had transferred virtually all decision-making authority to his wife, ensuring that she would have complete control over the business empire he had spent decades building. With Frederick's death, Anastasia had also acquired valuable experience in managing complex financial and legal affairs, skills that would prove essential as she contemplated even more ambitious targets for her future operations. The months spent overseeing Frederick's business interests had taught her about investments, contracts, and corporate structures that opened entirely new possibilities for both wealth accumulation and victim selection. Her fifth husband was chosen with even greater care than his predecessors, selected from among the highest ranks of the nobility after a period of careful observation and strategic positioning. Duke William Ravencrest was a man of immense wealth and political influence, possessed of vast estates in 3 countries and connections that extended to multiple royal courts. His advanced age and documented history of heart problems made him a logical target for methods that would produce death through apparent cardiac failure, while his political prominence would provide Anastasia with access to the most exclusive circles of power and privilege. The courtship with Duke William was conducted on a scale befitting his exalted station, involving elaborate social gatherings, expensive gifts, and carefully orchestrated public appearances that established their relationship as one of the most important romantic developments of the social season. William was genuinely smitten with the beautiful widow, whose combination of tragic romantic history, substantial wealth, and obvious intelligence made her the most desirable woman in his social circle. Their wedding was a grand affair that was attended by royalty and reported in newspapers throughout Europe, establishing Anastasia as one of the most prominent women of her generation. The ceremony took place in the Duke's private chapel, which had been decorated with flowers and tapestries that created a setting of almost fairy tale beauty. Anastasia's wedding dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace that emphasized her ethereal loveliness while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her status as a woman of mature years and proven character. The method Anastasia chose for William's elimination was based on her growing expertise in cardiovascular poisons, using a combination of plant and mineral toxins that would produce the symptoms of progressive heart disease while remaining undetectable by contemporary medical examination. The substances she employed were derived from digitalize and other cardiac-affecting compounds that she had learned to culture and concentrate through techniques developed during her previous operations. William's death, when it came after 18 months of marriage, was preceded by a series of increasingly severe cardiac episodes that appeared to confirm his physician's long-standing concerns about his heart condition. The symptoms began with minor chest pains and shortness of breath that could be attributed to his age and sedentary habits, then progressed through more dramatic episodes of arrhythmia and cardiac distress that left him increasingly dependent on medical care and Anastasia's devoted nursing. Throughout William's decline, Anastasia maintained the same exemplary performance that had characterized her previous widowhoods, displaying the perfect balance of grief, determination, and practical capability that society expected from a woman of her station. She consulted with the finest cardiac specialist available, implemented every recommended treatment and lifestyle modification, and maintained a detailed record of William's symptoms and medications that impressed his physicians with her scientific approach to his care. When William finally succumbed to what appeared to be a massive heart attack, Anastasia was once again holding his hand and weeping tears that convinced everyone present of her genuine grief and devastation. The funeral was attended by heads of state and members of royal families, establishing Anastasia as a widow of truly international prominence, whose future romantic choices would be matters of significant public interest and political consideration. The wealth that Anastasia inherited from William's estate elevated her to the ranks of the richest individuals in Europe, providing her with resources that exceeded the treasuries of small nations. More importantly, her position as William's widow had granted her access to political and social networks that operated at the highest levels of international power, opening possibilities for influence and manipulation that extended far beyond mere financial gain. Her sixth husband, Count Richard Blackwood, was selected through an even more sophisticated process of evaluation and preparation, chosen not only for his wealth and social position but also for his potential to provide access to specific political and commercial opportunities that aligned with Anastasia's long-term objectives. Richard was a younger man than her previous husbands, possessed of vigorous health and keen intelligence that would require more subtle and sophisticated elimination techniques. The method she developed for Richard's death represented the culmination of her expertise in biological warfare, involving an engineered plague organism that she had created through careful cultivation and selective breeding of various disease strains. The resulting pathogen was both highly lethal and virtually undetectable, producing symptoms that mimicked a severe case of influenza while actually destroying the victim's immune system and vital organs. Richard's illness progressed with terrifying speed once Anastasia began the final phase of his contamination, transforming him from a healthy man in his prime to a dying invalid within a matter of weeks. The symptoms were so severe and dramatic that even the most experienced physicians were baffled by the rapid progression and unusual characteristics of his condition. Anastasia's grief and desperation during this period were so convincing that several observers commented on how the tragedy seemed to be destroying her own health and sanity. When Richard died, after less than a month of illness, his death was attributed to a particularly virulent strain of influenza that had apparently been complicated by secondary infections and organ failure. The speed and severity of his decline were unusual enough to warrant extensive medical investigation, but the autopsy revealed only the expected damage from severe systemic infection, providing no evidence of foul play or unnatural causes. With Richard's death, Anastasia had achieved a level of wealth and influence that made her one of the most powerful individuals of her generation, possessing resources and connections that could shape the political and economic development of entire nations. More significantly, she had perfected techniques of murder that were so sophisticated and undetectable that she could eliminate virtually any target with complete confidence that her crimes would never be discovered or proven. As she stood once again in mourning clothes beside another husband's grave, Anastasia reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from orphan survivor to international figure of wealth and influence. Each death had taught her valuable lessons about human nature, medical science, and the mechanics of social and legal systems that protected the innocent and punished the guilty. She had learned to navigate these systems with such skill that she was now essentially immune to investigation or prosecution, protected by her reputation, resources, and the fundamental inability of contemporary authorities to comprehend or detect her methods. The game had become more sophisticated and the stakes higher with each successive operation, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Power belonged to those who were clever enough to seize it, and ruthless enough to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Anastasia had proven herself to be both, establishing a pattern of success that she was confident could be continued indefinitely as she pursued ever more ambitious targets and objectives. Her next victim was already selected, a man whose death would provide not only unprecedented wealth and influence, but also access to the ultimate prize that had always been her true objective. The game was entering its final phase, and Anastasia was prepared to risk everything on one last magnificent gamble that would either establish her as the most powerful woman in the world, or destroy her completely. But after 6 successful murders, she was confident that her luck and skill would carry her to victory once again. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the ballroom of Ashford Palace, as Lady Anastasia Deathmoor made her entrance into what would be remembered as the most spectacular social event of the 18th. Her gown of midnight blue silk seemed to absorb the light around her, creating an almost supernatural aura that drew every eye in the room to her solitary figure. At 32, she had reached the peak of her dark beauty, her pale skin luminous against the rich fabric, her emerald eyes holding depths that suggested both infinite sorrow and dangerous secrets. What none of the assembled nobility could have suspected was that they were witnessing the debut of history's most accomplished serial killer at the pinnacle of her deadly career. The occasion was the wedding celebration of Princess Charlotte to the Duke of Northumberland, an event that had drawn royalty and aristocrats from across Europe to witness the union and participate in the week-long festivities that would follow. For Anastasia, the gathering represented the perfect hunting ground for her most ambitious prey yet, a target whose elimination would provide not only unprecedented wealth but also access to the very apex of political and social power. Marquis Alexander Ravenswood stood near the marble columns that supported the ballroom's vaulted ceiling, his imposing figure commanding attention even among the assembled peers of the realm. At 45, he possessed the kind of distinguished appearance that came from generations of noble breeding, his silver-touched hair and penetrating gray eyes giving him an air of authority that had made him one of the most influential men in the kingdom. His wealth was legendary, encompassing vast estates in England, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as commercial interests that spanned 3 continents and generated revenues that exceeded the budgets of most European nations. More importantly for Anastasia's purposes, Alexander was unmarried and actively seeking a wife who could provide him with legitimate heirs to carry on his ancient bloodline. His previous romantic attachments had been brief and unsatisfactory, ending when potential brides proved incapable of meeting his exacting standards for intelligence, beauty, and social sophistication. The combination of his vast wealth, political influence, and apparent vulnerability to the charms of the right woman made him the perfect target for someone with Anastasia's unique talents and ambitions. The introduction between Anastasia and Alexander was arranged through mutual acquaintances who recognized the potential for a match that would unite 2 of the kingdom's most prominent figures. The initial meeting was conducted with all the formality and ceremony befitting their respective stations, but there was an immediate spark of mutual attraction that transcended mere social convention. Alexander was intrigued by Anastasia's combination of beauty, intelligence, and tragic romantic history, while she recognized in him the ultimate prize that would crown her career of systematic murder and acquisition. Their courtship unfolded over the course of 6 months, conducted on a scale of magnificence that became the talk of European high society. Alexander showered Anastasia with gifts that included rare jewels, priceless artworks, and even a private yacht that he commissioned specifically for her pleasure. Their public appearances together were chronicled in newspapers and magazines, with society columnists speculating about when the inevitable engagement announcement would be made and what kind of wedding ceremony would be appropriate for such prominent figures. Anastasia's strategy during this period was more sophisticated than any she had previously employed, requiring her to simultaneously play the role of romantic heroine, while conducting detailed reconnaissance of Alexander's habits, health, relationships, and financial arrangements. She needed to understand not only how to kill him effectively, but also how to position herself to inherit maximum benefit from his death, while avoiding the kind of scrutiny that might expose her previous crimes. The challenge was complicated by Alexander's naturally suspicious nature and his extensive network of advisors, bodyguards, and servants who were trained to protect him from various forms of threat and deception. Unlike her previous husbands, who had been essentially solitary figures with limited security arrangements, Alexander was constantly surrounded by people whose job it was to identify and neutralize potential dangers to his person and interests. Anastasia adapted to these challenges by developing new techniques that were even more subtle and sophisticated than her previous methods. Instead of relying primarily on direct contamination of food and personal items, she began to experiment with environmental approaches that would expose Alexander to deadly agents through seemingly natural and unavoidable contact with contaminated surfaces, fabrics, and atmospheric particles. The specific method she chose for Alexander's elimination was based on her most advanced understanding of biological warfare, involving a genetically modified strain of tuberculosis that she had developed through years of careful cultivation and selective breeding. The organism was designed to be both highly virulent and specifically adapted to Alexander's particular genetic and physiological characteristics, ensuring that it would be both rapid in its effects and resistant to contemporary medical treatments. The wedding ceremony that united Anastasia and Alexander was conducted at Westminster Abbey, with the Archbishop of Canterbury himself officiating over the sacred rites that bound them in matrimony. The guest list included members of the royal family, heads of state, and virtually every prominent figure in European society, creating a spectacle that was reported in newspapers around the world. Anastasia's wedding dress was a masterpiece of French couture that took 6 months to create, incorporating hundreds of pearls and diamonds into patterns that seemed to make her glow with inner light. The honeymoon that followed their wedding was equally spectacular, involving a grand tour of Alexander's various properties and business interests that allowed Anastasia to study the full extent of his wealth and influence. While beginning the subtle process of his contamination, they visited his ancestral castle in Scotland, his racing stables in Ireland, his London mansion, and his commercial enterprises in major cities throughout Europe, creating an itinerary that provided numerous opportunities for Anastasia to implement her deadly preparations. The initial phase of Alexander's contamination was accomplished through modification of the environmental systems in his various residences, with Anastasia introducing microscopic amounts of the modified tuberculosis organism into air circulation systems, water supplies, and textile treatments that would ensure his constant exposure to the pathogen. The process was so gradual and subtle that even the most paranoid security arrangements could not have detected it, while the use of environmental vectors meant that Anastasia herself was never directly involved in the actual transmission process. The first symptoms of Alexander's illness appeared approximately 3 months after their wedding, manifesting as a persistent cough that he initially attributed to the changing seasons and the stress of integrating his new wife into his complex business and social arrangements. The cough was accompanied by minor fatigue and occasional episodes of chest discomfort that seemed consistent with the respiratory ailments that commonly affected people of his age and social class during the winter months. Anastasia's response to these early symptoms was perfectly calibrated to reinforce the impression of natural illness, while subtly encouraging Alexander to make decisions that would accelerate his decline and facilitate her inheritance of his estate. She expressed appropriate concern about his health while suggesting that he might benefit from reducing his business responsibilities and delegating more authority to trusted advisors, including, of course, his devoted wife, who was eager to help shoulder the burdens of managing his vast holdings. As Alexander's condition progressed, Anastasia gradually increased the concentration and frequency of his exposure to the modified tuberculosis organism, using a variety of delivery methods that ensured steady escalation of symptoms while maintaining the appearance of natural disease progression. His personal items were treated with infectious agents. His clothing was contaminated through contact with infected materials, and even the air in his private chambers was periodically enriched with airborne pathogens that he would inhale during his sleeping hours. The symptoms that emerged during this phase were both dramatic and seemingly authentic, including severe coughing episodes that produced blood, progressive weight loss that left him increasingly gaunt and weak, and episodes of fever and delirium that required constant medical attention. The attending physicians diagnosed his condition as an aggressive case of consumption, complicated by his age and the stress of his demanding lifestyle, prescribing treatments that were both expensive and completely ineffective against the engineered pathogen that was actually destroying his respiratory system. Throughout Alexander's decline, Anastasia maintained the same exemplary performance that had characterized her previous widowhoods, displaying the perfect balance of grief, determination, and practical capability that society expected from a devoted wife facing her husband's terminal illness. She consulted with the finest medical specialists available, implemented every recommended treatment protocol, and maintained detailed records of his symptoms and medications that impressed even the most experienced physicians with her scientific approach to his care. The legal and financial arrangements that Alexander made during his illness were skillfully orchestrated by Anastasia to ensure maximum benefit for herself while maintaining the appearance of his independent decision-making. She encouraged him to consolidate his various holdings under simplified management structures that would be easier for her to control after his death, while also suggesting updates to his will and estate planning documents that would provide her with virtually unlimited authority over his business empire. As Alexander's condition entered its final phase, the symptoms became increasingly severe and dramatic, including episodes of respiratory distress that left him gasping for breath, periods of delirium during which he spoke of hallucinations and childhood memories, and progressive physical wasting that transformed him from a robust man in his prime to a skeletal figure barely capable of leaving his bed. The medical specialists who attended him were baffled by the rapid progression and unusual characteristics of his illness, but attributed the severity to a particularly virulent strain of tuberculosis that was apparently resistant to all available treatments. The end came on a cold February morning. After a night of particularly severe respiratory distress during which Alexander struggled to breathe despite the oxygen treatments and medications that his physicians had prescribed, Anastasia was at his bedside when he drew his final breath, her tears and expressions of grief so convincing that even the attending medical staff were moved to comfort her in her devastating loss. The autopsy that was performed at Anastasia's own request revealed extensive damage to Alexander's respiratory system that was entirely consistent with advanced tuberculosis, complicated by secondary infections and organ failure. The examination was conducted by the kingdom's most prominent pathologists, who found no evidence of foul play or unnatural causes of death. Their detailed report concluded that Alexander had succumbed to a rare and aggressive variant of consumption that had proved resistant to all medical interventions. Despite the exemplary care provided by his devoted wife and the finest physicians available, the inheritance that Anastasia received from Alexander's estate was beyond anything she had previously imagined, including not only his liquid assets and real estate holdings, but also controlling interests in shipping companies, mining operations, manufacturing enterprises, and financial institutions that generated revenues exceeding the gross domestic product of most European nations. The legal documents that Alexander had signed during his illness had granted her virtually unlimited authority over this vast commercial empire, making her one of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the world. More significantly, Alexander's death had also provided Anastasia with access to political and social networks that operated at the highest levels of international power, including relationships with royal families, government officials, and commercial leaders who could facilitate her future operations on a global scale. The combination of unprecedented wealth and international influence made her virtually untouchable by conventional law enforcement or regulatory authorities. The funeral that followed Alexander's death was a state occasion that attracted mourners from around the world, including members of multiple royal families, heads of government, and prominent figures from every sector of society. Anastasia's behavior throughout the ceremony was exemplary, displaying exactly the right mixture of profound grief and dignified composure that befitted a woman who had lost not only her beloved husband, but also her closest advisor and partner in managing vast commercial enterprises. The period of mourning that followed Alexander's funeral was characterized by an outpouring of sympathy and support from the highest levels of society, with prominent figures competing to offer comfort and assistance to the grieving widow. Anastasia received personal condolences from royalty, invitations to private audiences with heads of state, and offers of business partnerships from commercial leaders who recognized that her inherited wealth and influence made her one of the most important figures in the international economy. Yet even as Anastasia basked in the sympathy and admiration of a society that viewed her as a tragic figure, deserving of compassion and support, There were beginning to be whispers in certain quarters about the remarkable pattern of misfortune that seemed to follow her through her marriages. 7 husbands dead of natural causes within a span of 15 years was statistically improbable enough to attract notice from individuals who specialized in analyzing patterns of crime and suspicious behavior. The most persistent of these observers was Inspector Thomas Grimsby of the Metropolitan Police, a young investigator whose analytical mind and systematic approach to criminal investigation had earned him recognition as one of the most promising detectives of his generation. Grimsby had been quietly collecting information about Anastasia's marriages for several months, documenting the circumstances surrounding each husband's death, and looking for connections or inconsistencies that might suggest criminal activity. What troubled Grimsby most was not any single aspect of Anastasia's history, but rather the overall pattern that emerged when her marriages were examined as a whole. The progression from relatively modest inheritances to increasingly vast fortunes suggested a learning curve that was inconsistent with mere bad luck or coincidence. More disturbing still was the apparent escalation in the sophistication of the medical conditions that had claimed her husband's lives, progressing from simple ailments to rare and complex diseases that seemed almost too convenient in their timing and characteristic. Grimsby's investigation was complicated by Anastasia's impeccable reputation and the genuine affection and respect that she commanded from everyone who knew her personally. The doctors who had treated her husbands spoke of her dedication and scientific approach to their care. The servants who worked in her various households testified to her kindness and generosity. Even her husband's relatives and business associates described her as a devoted wife who had sacrificed her own health and happiness to provide comfort during their final illnesses. More challenging still was the complete absence of any physical evidence that might suggest foul play in any of the deaths. Contemporary medical science lacked the sophisticated forensic techniques that would be developed in later generations, making it impossible to detect the kinds of biological and chemical agents that Anastasia had used to murder her husbands. The autopsies that had been performed showed only the expected damage from the diagnosed diseases, providing no indication that the victims had been exposed to artificial pathogens or toxic substances. As Grimsby continued his discreet investigation, he began to realize that he was confronting a form of murder so sophisticated and subtle that it might be impossible to prove using the legal and scientific resources available in the mid-19th century. If his suspicions were correct, Anastasia had developed techniques of killing that left no traces that contemporary investigators could detect or identify, making her essentially immune to prosecution despite having committed multiple murders. The challenge was further complicated by Anastasia's vast wealth and political influence, which provided her with resources and connections that could neutralize most conventional forms of investigation or prosecution. Any attempt to bring charges against her would require not only concrete evidence of criminal activity, but also the support of legal and political authorities who might be reluctant to pursue a case against such a prominent and well-connected figure. Yet, despite these obstacles, Grimsby remained convinced that Anastasia was guilty of systematic murder and was determined to find some way to bring her to justice before she could claim additional victims. His investigation had already identified several potential targets among the eligible bachelors of high society, men whose wealth and social position made them logical candidates for her next matrimonial venture. As the one-year anniversary of Alexander's death approached, Anastasia began to emerge from her period of formal mourning and resume her participation in social activities that would allow her to evaluate potential candidates for her next marriage. The game was entering a new phase, with higher stakes and more sophisticated opposition than she had previously encountered. But after 7 successful murders, she remained confident that her superior intelligence and refined techniques would allow her to eliminate any threats to her continued success while pursuing even more ambitious targets and objectives. The perfect widow was preparing for her next campaign, unaware that she was no longer hunting alone in the shadows, but had herself become the prey in a deadly game where the hunter possessed resources, and determination that might finally prove equal to her own considerable talents for deception and murder. The gas lamps of Inspector Thomas Grimsby's cramped office cast eerie shadows across the collection of documents, photographs, and case files that covered every available surface of his desk. The Metropolitan Police headquarters was nearly empty at this late hour, with only the night shift officers remaining to maintain order in the labyrinthine building that served as the nerve center for law enforcement in the world's largest city. Yet Grimsby continued his solitary vigil, studying the evidence he had compiled over months of discreet investigation into the most challenging case of his career: the systematic murders committed by Lady Anastasia Deathmoor. At 28, Grimsby possessed the kind of analytical mind that had made him the youngest inspector in the Metropolitan Police. His promotion earned through a combination of intellectual brilliance and dogged determination that had solved cases his more experienced colleagues had dismissed as unsolvable. His lean frame and intense gray eyes gave him an almost scholarly appearance that had initially led criminals to underestimate him, a mistake they rarely made twice. But the case that now consumed his every waking moment was unlike anything he had previously encountered, involving a suspect whose intelligence and resources far exceeded those of the common murderers and thieves who typically occupied his attention. The evidence spread across his desk told a story that was as compelling as it was frustrating, revealing a pattern of behavior that suggested systematic murder while providing no concrete proof that would satisfy a court of law. 7 marriages, 7 deaths, 7 inheritances, each following a trajectory that defied statistical probability while remaining technically within the bounds of natural misfortune. The progression from modest estates to vast fortunes suggested a learning curve that was inconsistent with mere coincidence. Yet every aspect of each case had been documented and verified by medical professionals who found no evidence of foul play. Grimsby's investigation had begun 6 months earlier, when a chance conversation with Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, the nephew of Anastasia's 6th husband, had revealed details about Count Richard's final illness that seemed inconsistent with the official medical records. According to Dr. Blackwood, his uncle had been in excellent health just weeks before his death, displaying none of the chronic conditions that might have predisposed him to the severe influenza that had supposedly claimed his life. More disturbing still were the uncle's own comments during his final days, when he had apparently expressed bewilderment about his sudden illness and mentioned strange symptoms that had not been included in the physician's official reports. This initial anomaly had prompted Grimsby to examine the circumstances surrounding Anastasia's other marriages, a process that had revealed additional inconsistencies and suspicious coincidences that reinforced his growing conviction that she was responsible for her husband's deaths. The medical conditions that had claimed her victims showed a progression and sophistication that suggested someone was learning and refining murder techniques with each successive operation. Early deaths had involved relatively common ailments like consumption and heart disease, while later victims had succumbed to rare and complex conditions that would have required considerable medical knowledge to produce artificially. More troubling still was the pattern of legal and financial arrangements that had preceded each death, with Anastasia consistently positioning herself to inherit maximum benefit from her husband's estates, while avoiding the kind of scrutiny that might expose her criminal activities. The timing of will modifications, business reorganizations, and estate planning changes showed a level of foresight and calculation that seemed inconsistent with the grief-stricken widow persona that she presented to the world. Yet despite the compelling nature of this circumstantial evidence, Grimsby faced seemingly insurmountable obstacles in building a case that could result in prosecution and conviction. Contemporary medical science lacked the forensic techniques necessary to detect the sophisticated biological and chemical agents that Anastasia appeared to be using to murder her victims. The autopsies that had been performed showed only the expected damage from the diagnosed diseases, providing no indication that the deaths had been caused by artificial means. Even more challenging was Anastasia's position in society, which provided her with resources and connections that could neutralize most conventional forms of investigation. Her vast wealth allowed her to employ the finest legal counsel available, while her social prominence ensured that any accusations against her would be met with skepticism and resistance from influential figures who had personal and professional relationships with her. The possibility of prosecuting such a prominent figure without absolutely conclusive evidence was so politically dangerous that Grimsby's superiors had already begun to express concern about the direction of his investigation. The breakthrough that Grimsby had been seeking came from an unexpected source. A former servant named Margaret Thornton, who had worked in the household of Baron Frederick Ashworth during the final months of his life. Margaret had been dismissed shortly before Frederick's death under circumstances that she claimed were suspicious, involving her discovery of unusual materials in Anastasia's private chambers and her subsequent attempts to question her employer about their purpose. According to Margaret's testimony, which she provided only after Grimsby had guaranteed her protection and anonymity, Anastasia had maintained a private laboratory in the basement of Frederick's estate, where she conducted experiments with various organic and chemical substances. The servant had observed her employer working with materials that included rare plants, mineral compounds, and what appeared to be biological specimens that were kept in specially constructed containers and cultivation systems. Most significantly, Margaret claimed to have witnessed Anastasia deliberately contaminating Frederick's personal items with substances from her laboratory, including his shaving equipment, clothing, and food preparation areas. The servant had been discovered during one of these observations, and had been dismissed immediately, with threats of legal action if she ever spoke about what she had seen. Her subsequent attempts to find employment had been sabotaged by negative references from Anastasia, forcing her into increasingly desperate circumstances that had prevented her from coming forward with her testimony until now. While Margaret's account provided the most direct evidence yet of Anastasia's criminal activities, Grimsby recognized that the testimony of a dismissed servant with obvious grievances against her former employer would be insufficient to secure a conviction in court. More problematic still was the fact that the alleged laboratory had been destroyed in a fire shortly after Frederick's death, eliminating any physical evidence that might have corroborated Margaret's claims. Nevertheless, Margaret's testimony provided Grimsby with valuable insights into Anastasia's methods and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited in a more direct confrontation. If the widow was indeed maintaining secret laboratories and conducting biological experiments, then she was taking risks that might eventually provide the concrete evidence necessary for prosecution. The challenge was finding a way to expose these activities without alerting Anastasia to the investigation and giving her the opportunity to eliminate evidence or escape prosecution. Grimsby's strategy for the next phase of his investigation involved a dangerous gambit that would require him to make direct contact with Anastasia while concealing his true identity and purpose. Using connections within London's social circles, he arranged to be introduced to her at a charity gala sponsored by the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, an event that would provide the perfect cover for initiating contact with his target. The meeting took place on a foggy November evening at the palatial Grosvenor House, where London's elite had gathered to support the charitable cause while enjoying an evening of fine dining, musical entertainment, and social networking. Grimsby had prepared meticulously for the encounter, adopting the persona of a wealthy young gentleman with interests in medical research and scientific advancement, a background that would allow him to engage Anastasia in conversations about topics related to her suspected criminal activities. When Grimsby was finally introduced to Lady Anastasia Deathmoor, he found himself confronting a woman whose beauty and charm were even more formidable than he had anticipated. Her elegant black evening gown emphasized her pale complexion and striking features, while her gracious manner and intelligent conversation made it easy to understand why so many prominent men had been captivated by her charms. Yet beneath her surface appeal, Grimsby detected something that made his investigative instincts recoil, a coldness in her emerald eyes that suggested depths of calculation and ruthlessness that were carefully hidden beneath her refined exterior. Their initial conversation proceeded according to Grimsby's plan, with Anastasia showing polite interest in his supposed background in medical research, while providing carefully measured responses to his subtle inquiries about her own experiences with illness and medical treatment. Her answers were technically accurate and seemingly innocent, yet Grimsby noticed a precision in her terminology and a familiarity with complex medical concepts that seemed inconsistent with her claimed background as a grieving widow who had learned about such matters only through tragic personal experience. As the evening progressed, Grimsby became increasingly convinced that he was indeed confronting a master criminal whose intelligence and sophistication far exceeded those of any suspect he had previously encountered. Anastasia's responses to his questions revealed not only extensive knowledge of medical and scientific subjects, but also a keen awareness of legal procedures and investigative techniques that suggested she was fully conscious of the risks associated with her activities and had developed countermeasures to protect herself from detection. More disturbing still was Grimsby's growing realization that Anastasia was conducting her own evaluation of him, using the same subtle questioning techniques and psychological manipulation that he was attempting to employ against her. Her inquiries about his background, interests, and social connections were presented as polite conversation, yet they followed patterns that suggested systematic intelligence gathering, designed to determine whether he represented a potential threat to her operation. The turning point in their encounter came when Anastasia made a casual comment about the importance of maintaining good health through proper nutrition and lifestyle choices, mentioning her own practice of growing medicinal herbs in the gardens of her various estates. The remark was delivered with perfect innocence, yet it seemed to confirm Margaret Thornton's testimony about her maintenance of biological cultivation systems that could be used to produce the pathogens responsible for her husband's deaths. Grimsby's response to this revelation was carefully controlled, but he suspected that his momentary reaction had been detected by his adversary's keen observation skills. From that point forward, their conversation took on a different quality, with both participants engaging in increasingly sophisticated verbal sparring that resembled a chess match played with words and subtle implications rather than direct statements. By the end of the evening, Grimsby was certain that Anastasia had identified him as a potential threat, just as he had confirmed his suspicions about her criminal activities. The challenge now was determining who would make the next move in what had become a deadly game of cat and mouse between two highly intelligent adversaries with vastly different resources and capabilities. In the days that followed their initial meeting, Grimsby found himself the recipient of unexpected social invitations that seemed designed to provide Anastasia with additional opportunities to study his behavior and motivations. She arranged for him to be included in dinner parties, cultural events, and business gatherings, where she could observe his interactions with other people, while presenting herself as a gracious hostess who was merely being kind to a promising young gentleman who was new to London society. These encounters allowed Grimsby to gather additional evidence about Anastasia's methods and associates, but they also exposed him to increasing danger as she began to suspect the true nature of his interest in her affairs. Her questions became more pointed and her observations more penetrating, suggesting that she was systematically probing his background and motivations while evaluating him as a potential victim for elimination. The crisis that Grimsby had been expecting came sooner than anticipated, manifesting as a series of minor illnesses and health problems that seemed to coincide with his increased contact with Anastasia. A persistent cough developed after attending one of her dinner parties, followed by episodes of nausea and fatigue that occurred after social events where she had been present. While these symptoms could have been attributed to the seasonal ailments that commonly affected residents of London's polluted environment, their timing and progression suggested that he was being systematically exposed to pathogenic agents as part of Anastasia's evaluation process. Recognizing that his investigation had reached a critical juncture where continued direct contact with his suspect would likely result in his own death, Grimsby made the difficult decision to withdraw from social interactions with Anastasia, while developing alternative strategies for gathering the evidence necessary to build a prosecutable case. The experience had provided him with valuable insights into her methods and psychology, but it had also demonstrated the extreme personal danger involved in any direct confrontation with such a sophisticated and ruthless adversary. As he sat in his office reviewing the intelligence he had gathered during his dangerous infiltration operation, Grimsby realized that he was confronting a criminal whose capabilities exceeded anything that contemporary law enforcement was equipped to handle. Anastasia possessed not only the technical knowledge necessary to commit perfect murders, but also the social position and financial resources that made her virtually immune to conventional investigative techniques. Yet despite these overwhelming obstacles, Grimsby remained determined to find some way to bring her to justice before she could claim additional victims. His investigation had identified several potential targets among London's eligible bachelors, men whose wealth and social position made them logical candidates for her next matrimonial venture. The challenge now was finding a way to protect these potential victims while continuing to gather evidence that might eventually lead to her prosecution and conviction. The game between inspector and killer was entering its most dangerous phase, with both players fully aware of each other's identities and capabilities. Anastasia had demonstrated that she could eliminate threats to her operations with impunity, while Grimsby had shown that he possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to penetrate her carefully constructed defenses. The outcome of their confrontation would determine not only whether justice would be served for her previous crimes, but also whether she would be free to continue her deadly career with even greater sophistication and ambition than before. The morning mist clung to the Thames like a shroud as Inspector Thomas Grimsby made his way through the empty corridors of Scotland Yard, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the pre-dawn silence. 3 weeks had passed since his last encounter with Lady Anastasia Deathmoor. 3 weeks during which his health had steadily deteriorated despite the efforts of London's finest physicians to diagnose and treat his mysterious ailment. The cough that had begun as a minor irritation had evolved into violent episodes that left him gasping for breath, while the fatigue that had initially seemed like simple exhaustion now threatened to overwhelm him completely. Grimsby's pale reflection in the window of his office revealed the toll that his investigation had exacted upon his once robust constitution. His face had acquired a gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance that made him look decades older than his 28 years, while his clothes hung loosely on a frame that had lost nearly 2 stone in weight over the past month. Yet despite his physical decline, his mind remained sharp and focused on the task that had become his obsession: gathering enough evidence to expose Anastasia's crimes before his own death made such efforts impossible. The documents spread across his desk represented the culmination of months of painstaking investigation. A comprehensive dossier that detailed every aspect of Anastasia's criminal career, from her mysterious origins at Ravensgate Manor to her most recent marriage to Marquis Alexander Ravenswood. The evidence was compelling in its scope and consistency, revealing patterns of behavior that could only be explained by systematic murder conducted over a period of nearly 2 decades. Yet Grimsby knew that his findings would be dismissed as the fevered imaginings of a dying man unless he could provide the kind of concrete proof that would satisfy a court of law. The breakthrough he had been seeking came from an unexpected source: a coded letter that had been discovered among the personal effects of Margaret Thornton, the former servant who had provided crucial testimony about Anastasia's secret laboratory. Margaret had been found dead in her lodgings 2 days earlier, apparently having succumbed to the same mysterious wasting disease that was now claiming Grimsby's own life. But hidden within the pages of her Bible was a detailed account of her observations during her employment at Baron Frederick's estate, written in a simple cipher that Grimsby had managed to decode through painstaking analysis. According to Margaret's secret journal, Anastasia's activities had extended far beyond the simple contamination of her husband's personal effects. The servant had witnessed elaborate cultivation systems that produced exotic fungi and bacterial cultures, sophisticated distillation equipment that concentrated biological toxins into nearly undetectable forms, and detailed scientific records that documented the effects of various pathogenic agents on human subjects. Most significantly, Margaret had copied several pages from Anastasia's private notebooks, including formulas and procedures that provided explicit instructions for producing the specific diseases that had claimed each of her husband's lives. Armed with this documentary evidence, Grimsby made one final attempt to build a case that could result in Anastasia's prosecution. Approaching his superiors at Scotland Yard with a complete presentation of his findings and Margaret's corroborating testimony, the response was predictably disappointing, with senior officials expressing skepticism about evidence provided by a dismissed servant with obvious grievances against her former employer, while noting that the alleged laboratory had been destroyed and could not be examined to verify the claims being made. More problematic still was the political dimension of any potential prosecution, as Anastasia's wealth and social connections provided her with influence that extended to the highest levels of government and law enforcement. Several of the officials to whom Grimsby presented his case had personal or professional relationships with the accused, while others recognized that pursuing such charges against a prominent figure without absolutely conclusive evidence would be career suicide for everyone involved. The final rejection of his investigation came from Commissioner Sir Roderick Blackstone himself, who summoned Grimsby to his office for a meeting that effectively ended any official interest in pursuing charges against Lady Anastasia Deathmoor. The commissioner expressed sympathy for Grimsby's obvious illness while suggesting that his condition might be affecting his judgment and causing him to see criminal conspiracies where none actually existed. The case was officially closed, with instructions that no further investigative resources were to be devoted to examining Anastasia's affairs without new evidence that met much higher standards of verification and credibility. As Grimsby left the commissioner's office for what he knew would be the final time, he was approached by a well-dressed gentleman who introduced himself as Lord Chancellor Pemberton, one of the most senior legal officials in the kingdom. Pemberton's message was delivered with polite courtesy, but its implications were unmistakably threatening. Any attempt by Grimsby to pursue his investigation through unofficial channels or to share his findings with journalists or other outside parties would result in legal action that would destroy his reputation and financial security, while also exposing him to charges of criminal libel and harassment of a prominent citizen. The meeting with Lord Pemberton confirmed what Grimsby had already begun to suspect, that Anastasia's influence extended far beyond what he had previously imagined, reaching into the very institutions that were supposed to protect society from criminals like her. The systematic obstruction of his investigation could only be explained by a network of corruption and intimidation that had been carefully constructed to shield her activities from official scrutiny while eliminating anyone who posed a threat to her continued operation. Yet even as his official channels for seeking justice were closed off one by one, Grimsby continued his private investigation with the desperate determination of a man who knew his time was running out. His illness had progressed to the point where he could barely manage the stairs to his lodgings, and the physicians who examined him spoke in hushed tones about mysterious ailments that defied diagnosis and treatment. The irony was not lost on him that he was dying from the same kind of unexplained medical condition that had claimed Anastasia's husbands, while possessing detailed knowledge of how such deaths were artificially induced. The final phase of Grimsby's investigation focused on identifying and warning Anastasia's potential next victim, a task that required him to monitor her social activities, despite his deteriorating health and the surveillance that he suspected was being conducted by her agents. Through careful observation and analysis of society reports in the newspapers, he had identified several candidates who fit the pattern of her previous targets. Wealthy, unmarried men of mature years whose deaths would provide substantial financial benefits while attracting minimal suspicion from authorities. The most likely candidate appeared to be Prince Leopold of Saxe-Weimar, a distant cousin of Queen Victoria, who possessed vast estates in both England and Germany, along with commercial interests that generated revenues comparable to those of a small nation. Leopold's advanced age, documented health problems, and recent expressions of interest in remarrying made him an ideal target for someone with Anastasia's particular talents and ambitions. More significantly, a successful marriage to Leopold would provide her with royal connections and political influence that would make her virtually untouchable by any form of conventional law enforcement. Grimsby's attempt to warn Prince Leopold was thwarted by the same network of influence and intimidation that had obstructed his official investigation. His requests for an audience were denied by court officials who cited security concerns and protocol requirements, while his letters went unanswered despite repeated attempts to communicate the urgency of his message. Even his efforts to approach Leopold through intermediaries were blocked by advisors who had apparently been instructed to prevent any contact between the prince and the increasingly desperate inspector. The final confirmation of Grimsby's worst fears came through a society announcement in the Times, revealing that Lady Anastasia Deathmoor had been formally presented to Prince Leopold at a private reception hosted by the Duke of Wellington. The carefully worded account described the meeting as a delightful social occasion during which the prince had been charmed by the beautiful widow's intelligence and grace, while expressing his admiration for her charitable activities and her courage in overcoming the tragic losses that had marked her romantic history. Reading this announcement from his sickbed, where he now spent most of his time struggling against the advancing symptoms of his mysterious ailment, Grimsby realized that he had failed in his ultimate objective of preventing Anastasia from claiming another victim. The game between them was entering its final phase, with his own death imminent and her next murder already in the planning stages. All that remained was to document his findings in a form that might someday be discovered and used to expose her crimes, even if justice came too late to save her future victims. The testament that Grimsby composed during his final days was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, providing a complete account of Anastasia's criminal career, along with detailed analysis of her methods and the systematic obstruction that had prevented official action against her. He arranged for multiple copies to be created and hidden in various locations throughout London, ensuring that his work would survive even if attempts were made to suppress or destroy the evidence he had compiled. The end came for Inspector Thomas Grimsby on a cold December morning, as a London fog shrouded the city in gloom that seemed appropriate for the death of one of its most dedicated servants of justice. He was found in his lodgings by his landlady, who had become concerned about his failure to respond to her knocking. The attending physician diagnosed his death as resulting from a rare wasting disease that had apparently resisted all attempts at treatment, noting the unusual combination of respiratory and neurological symptoms that had characterized his final illness. The funeral that followed was a modest affair, attended by his colleagues from Scotland Yard and a few personal friends who remembered him as a promising young investigator whose career had been cut short by tragic illness. Commissioner Blackstone delivered a eulogy that praised Grimsby's dedication and analytical skills, while diplomatically avoiding any mention of his final investigation or the controversial theories that had consumed his last months. The official cause of death was recorded as natural causes, with no indication that foul play had been suspected or investigated. Yet, even as Grimsby's body was being lowered into its grave at Kensal Green Cemetery, Lady Anastasia Deathmoor was already implementing the next phase of her campaign to secure Prince Leopold as her eighth husband. The courtship was conducted with all the sophistication and subtlety that she had perfected through years of experience, involving carefully orchestrated social encounters, expensive gifts, and gradual escalation of intimate contact that would facilitate the biological contamination process when the time came for Leopold's elimination. The prince proved to be a more challenging target than her previous husbands, possessing not only extensive security arrangements but also a naturally suspicious temperament that had been honed by decades of experience with fortune hunters and social climbers who sought to exploit his wealth and position. Yet Anastasia's combination of beauty, intelligence, and tragic romantic history proved irresistible even to such a worldly and sophisticated man. gradually breaking down his defenses until he found himself genuinely infatuated with the mysterious woman who seemed to understand his loneliness and desire for companionship. Their engagement was announced 6 months after Grimsby's death, creating a sensation in society circles throughout Europe and establishing Anastasia as one of the most prominent figures of her generation. The upcoming marriage was celebrated as a romantic triumph that would unite two people who had suffered great losses and deserved happiness in their mature years, while also creating political and commercial connections that would benefit both England and the German states. The wedding ceremony that took place at Windsor Castle was attended by royalty from across Europe, including Queen Victoria herself, who gave her personal blessing to the union and praised Anastasia's resilience in overcoming the tragedies that had marked her previous marriages. The bride's dress was a masterpiece of silk and diamonds that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, while the reception that followed featured entertainment and refreshments that established new standards for royal magnificence. Prince Leopold's death came exactly 18 months after their wedding, following a pattern that had become familiar to anyone who had studied Anastasia's previous marriages. The illness began with minor symptoms that could be attributed to his age and the stress of managing extensive royal and commercial responsibilities, then progressed through increasingly severe episodes that left him dependent on medical care and his wife's devoted nursing. The final diagnosis was a rare form of blood cancer that had apparently been triggered by exposure to industrial chemicals from his German mining operations, a conclusion that was accepted without question by the international medical specialists who examined his case. The inheritance that Anastasia received from Leopold's estate elevated her to a level of wealth and influence that exceeded the resources of most sovereign nations, providing her with properties, investments, and political connections that spanned multiple continents. More significantly, her position as the widow of a royal prince had granted her a place in the succession of European nobility that could never be revoked, ensuring that she would maintain her status and protection regardless of any future suspicions about her activities. The funeral was a state occasion that attracted mourners from around the world, with Anastasia's grief-stricken performance earning praise from observers who commented on her obvious devotion to her late husband and her courage in facing yet another devastating personal loss. The sympathy and support she received from the highest levels of international society confirmed her position as one of the most respected and influential women of her generation, while also providing her with access to potential victims whose wealth and status exceeded even her previous targets. As the 19th century drew to a close, Lady Anastasia Deathmoor had achieved a level of success that exceeded the wildest ambitions of any criminal in history. 8 marriages, 8 murders, 8 fortunes acquired through systematic elimination of the men who had trusted her with their lives and their legacies. Her techniques had evolved from simple poisoning to sophisticated biological warfare that left no traces contemporary science could detect, while her social position had grown from modest nobility to international prominence that provided immunity from investigation or prosecution. Yet, even as she stood at the pinnacle of her criminal career, Anastasia was already planning her next campaign, having identified potential targets among the royal families and commercial leaders of the emerging 20th century. The Industrial Revolution had created new forms of wealth and power that presented unprecedented opportunities for someone with her unique talents, while advances in transportation and communication would allow her to operate on a global scale that had been impossible for previous generations of criminals. The game that had begun with the mysterious deaths at Ravensgate Manor had evolved into something approaching international terrorism, with a single individual possessing the resources and capabilities to influence the political and economic development of entire nations through strategic elimination of key figures. The perfect murders she had committed were merely the foundation for even more ambitious projects that would reshape the world according to her vision of power and control. Standing in the garden of her latest acquired estate, Surrounded by the exotic plants and cultivation systems that produce the biological weapons she used to eliminate her enemies, Anastasia reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from orphan survivor to international figure of wealth and influence. Every death had been a lesson in human nature and social systems, teaching her valuable insights into the mechanisms of power and the methods by which intelligent individuals could manipulate those systems to achieve their objectives. The 19th century had been merely her apprenticeship, a period of learning and experimentation that had prepared her for the greater challenges and opportunities of the new century that was dawning. The 20th century would belong to those who possessed the vision and ruthlessness to seize the possibilities it offered. And Anastasia was confident that she was uniquely qualified to claim her place among the most powerful individuals in human history. Inspector Thomas Grimsby's testament lay forgotten in its hiding places throughout London, awaiting discovery by some future generation that might possess the scientific knowledge and investigative techniques necessary to understand and act upon the evidence he had compiled. But for now, the perfect killer walked free among her unsuspecting victims, protected by wealth, influence, and techniques of murder so sophisticated that they remained beyond the reach of contemporary justice. The Plague Bride had won completely, and her reign of terror was just beginning.